The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 2, Side 2. The Jews of England, excluded from landholding and from the guilds, became merchants and financiers. Some waxed rich through usury, and all were hated for it. Lords and squires equipped themselves for the Crusades with money borrowed from the Jews. In return, they pledged the revenues of their lands, and the Christian peasant fumed at the thought of moneylenders fattening on his toil. In 1144, young William of Norwich was found dead. The Jews were accused of having killed him to use his blood, and the Jewish quarter of the city was sacked and fired. King Henry II protected the Jews. Henry III did likewise, but took £422,000 from them in taxes and capital levies in 7 years. At the coronation of Richard I in London in 1190, a minor altercation, encouraged by nobles seeking escape from their debt to Jews, developed into a pogrom that spread to Lincoln, Stamford, and Lynn. In York, in the same year, a mob led by Richard de Malabestia, who was deeply indebted to the Jews, killed 350 of them. In addition, 150 York Jews, led by their rabbi Yom Tov, slew themselves. In 1211, 300 rabbis left England and France to begin life anew in Palestine. 7 years later, many Jews emigrated when Henry III enforced the Edict of the Badge. In 1255, rumors spread through Lincoln that a boy named Hugh had been enticed into the Jewish quarter, and there had been scourged, crucified, and pierced with a lance in the presence of a rejoicing Jewish crowd. Armed bands invaded the settlement, seized the rabbi who was supposed to have presided over the ceremony, tied him to the tail of a horse, dragged him through the streets, and hanged him. 91 Jews were arrested, 18 were hanged. Many prisoners were saved by the intercession of courageous Dominican monks. During the civil war that disordered England between 1257 and 1267, the populace got out of hand, and pogroms almost wiped out the Jewish communities of London, Canterbury, Northampton, Winchester, Worcester, Lincoln, and Cambridge. Houses were looted and destroyed, deeds and bonds were burned, and the surviving Jews were left almost penniless. The English kings were now borrowing from the Christian bankers of Florence or Cahors. They no longer needed the Jews and found it troublesome to protect them. In 1290, Edward I ordered the 16,000 remaining Jews of England to leave the country by November 1st, abandoning all their immovable realty and all their collectible loans. Many were drowned in crossing the channel in small boats. Some were robbed by the ship's crews. Those who reached France were told by the government that they must leave by Lent of 1291. In France, too, the spiritual climate changed for the Jews with the Crusades against the Turks in Asia and the Albigensian heretics of Languedoc. Bishops preached anti-Semitic sermons that stirred the people. At Béziers, an attack upon the Jewish quarter was a regular rite of Holy Week. Finally, in 1160, a Christian prelate forbade such preaching, but required the Jewish community to pay a special tax every Palm Sunday. At Toulouse, the Jews were forced to send a representative to the cathedral each Good Friday to receive publicly a box on the ears as a mild reminder of everlasting guilt. In 1171, several Jews were burned at Blois on a charge of using Christian blood in Passover rites. Seeing a chance to turn a pious penny, King Philip Augustus ordered all the Jews in his realm to be imprisoned as poisoners of Christian wells, and then released them on payment of a heavy ransom, this in 1190. A year later he banished them, confiscated all their realty, and gave their synagogues to the church. In 1190 he had 80 Jews of Orange killed because one of his agents had been hanged by the city authorities for murdering a Jew. In 1198, he recalled the Jews to France, and so regulated their banking business as to secure large profits to himself. In 1236, Christian crusaders invaded the Jewish settlements of Anjou and Poitou, especially those at Bordeaux and Angoulême, and bade all Jews be baptized. When the Jews refused, the crusaders trampled 3,000 of them to death under their horses' hoofs. Pope Gregory IX condemned the slaughter, but did not raise the dead. St. Louis advised his people not to discuss religion with Jews. The layman, he told Joinville, when he hears any speak ill of the Christian faith, should defend it not with words, but with the sword, which he should thrust into the other's belly as far as it will go. In 1254 he banished the Jews from France, confiscating their property and their synagogues. A few years later he readmitted them and restored their synagogues. They were rebuilding their communities when Philip the Fair in 1306 had them all imprisoned, confiscated their credits and all their goods except the clothes they wore, and expelled them to the number of 100,000 from France with provisions for 1 day. The king profited so handsomely from the operation that he presented a synagogue to his coachman. So crowded a juxtaposition of bloody episodes scattered over 2 centuries makes a one-sided picture. In Provence, Italy, Sicily, and in the Byzantine Empire after the 9th century, there were only minor persecutions of the Jews, and they found means of protecting themselves in Christian Spain. Even in Germany, England, and France, the periods of peace were long, and a generation after each tragedy, the Jews there were again numerous, and some were prosperous. Nevertheless, their traditions carried down the bitter memory of those tragic interludes. The days of peace were made anxious by the ever-present danger of pogroms, and every Jew had to learn by heart the prayer to be recited in the moment of martyrdom. The pursuit of wealth was made more feverish by the harassed insecurity of its gains. The jibes of gamins in the street were ever ready to greet the wearers of the yellow badge. The ignominy of a helpless and secluded minority burned into the soul, broke down individual pride and interracial amity, and left in the eyes of the northern Jew that somber Judenschmerz, the sorrow of the Jews, which recalls 1,000 insults and injuries. For that one death on the cross, how many crucifixions? Chapter 17. The Mind and Heart of the Jew, 500 to 1300. 1. Letters. In every age the soul of the Jew has been torn between the resolve to make his way in a hostile world and his hunger for the goods of the mind. A Jewish merchant is a dead scholar. He envies and generously honors the man who, escaping the fever of wealth, pursues in peace the love of learning and the mirage of wisdom. The Jewish traders and bankers who went to the fairs of Torah stopped on the way to hear the great Rashi expound the Talmud. So, amid commercial cares or degrading poverty or mortal contumely, the Jews of the Middle Ages continued to produce grammarians, theologians, mystics, poets, scientists, and philosophers. And for a while, from 1150 to 1200, only the Moslems equaled them in widespread literacy and intellectual wealth. They had the advantage of living in contact or communication with Islam. Many of them read Arabic. The whole rich world of medieval Moslem culture was open to them. They took from Islam in science, medicine, and philosophy what they had given in religion to Muhammad and the Quran. And by their mediation they aroused the mind of the Christian West with the stimulus of Saracen thought. Within Islam, the Jews used Arabic in daily speech and written prose. Their poets kept to Hebrew, but accepted Arabic meters and poetic forms. In Christendom, the Jews spoke the language of the people among whom they lived, but wrote their literature and worshipped Yahweh in the ancient tongue. After Maimonides, the Jews of Spain, fleeing from Almohad persecution, abandoned Arabic for Hebrew as their literary medium. The revival of Hebrew was made possible by the devoted labors of Jewish philologists. The Old Testament text had become difficult to understand through lack of vowels and punctuation. 3 centuries of scholarship, from the 7th to the 10th, evolved the Masoretic, or tradition-sanctioned text, by adding vowel points, accent strokes, punctuation marks, verse separations, and marginal notes. Thereafter, any literate Jew could read the scriptures of his people. Such studies compelled the development of Hebrew grammar and lexicography. The poetry and learning of Menachem ben Saruk, from 910 to 970, attracted the attention of Hasdai ben Shaprut. The great minister called him to Cordova and encouraged him in the task of compiling a dictionary of biblical Hebrew. Menachem's pupil, Jehuda ibn Daud Chayuj, circa 1000, put Hebrew grammar upon a scientific basis with 3 Arabic works on the language of the Bible. Chayuj's pupil, Jonah ibn Janai, from 995 to 1050, of Saragossa, surpassed him with an Arabic book of critique that advanced Hebrew syntax and lexicography. Judah ibn Quraysh of Morocco, who flourished around 900, founded the comparative philology of the Semitic languages by his study of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. The Karaite Jew Abraham Alfazi, that is, of Fez, circa 980, furthered the matter with a dictionary in which the words of the Old Testament were reduced to their roots alphabetically arranged. Nathan ben Yechiel of Rome, who died in 1106, excelled all other Jewish lexicographers with his dictionary of the Talmud. In Narbonne, Joseph Kimchi and his sons Moses and David, the latter of whom lived from 1160 to 1235, labored for generations in these fields. David's Mikhlal, or compendium, became for centuries the authoritative grammar of Hebrew, and was a constant aid to King James's translators of the Bible. These names are chosen from 1,000. Profiting from this widespread scholarship, Hebrew poetry emancipated itself from Arabic exemplars, developed its own forms and themes, and produced in Spain alone 3 men quite equal to any triad in the Moslem or Christian literature of their age. Solomon ibn Gabirol, known to the Christian world as the philosopher Avicebron, was prepared by his personal tragedy to voice the feelings of Israel. This poet among philosophers and philosopher among poets, as Heine called him, was born at Malaga about 1021. He lost both parents early and grew up in a poverty that inclined him to morose contemplation. His verses caught the fancy of Yaqutl ibn Hassan, a high official in the Moslem city-state of Saragossa. There for a time Gabirol found protection and happiness and sang the joy of life. But Yaqutl was assassinated by enemies of the emir, and Gabirol fled. For years he wandered through Moslem Spain, poor and sick, and so thin that a fly could now bear me up with ease. Samuel ibn Nagdala, himself a poet, gave him refuge at Granada. There Solomon wrote his philosophical works and pledged his poetry to wisdom. How shall I forsake wisdom? I have made a covenant with her. She is my mother, I am her dearest child. She hath clasped her jewels about my neck. While life is mine, my spirit shall aspire unto her heavenly heights. I will not rest until I find her source. Presumably his impetuous pride caused his quarrel with Samuel. Still a youth in his late 20s, he resumed his wandering poverty. Misfortune humbled his spirit, and he turned from philosophy to religion. Lord, what is man? A carcass fouled and trodden, a noxious creature brimming with deceit, a fading flower that shrivels in the heat. His poetry took at times the somber grandeur of the Psalms. Establish peace for us, O Lord, in everlasting grace, nor let us be of thee abhorred, who art our dwelling place. We wander ever to and fro, or sit in chains in exile drear, yet still proclaim where'er we go the splendor of our Lord is here. His masterpiece, Keter Malkut, or Royal Crown, celebrated the greatness of God as his early poems had celebrated his own. From thee to thee I fly to win a place of refuge, and within thy shadow from thy anger hide, until thy wrath be turned aside. Unto thy mercy I will cling, until thou hearken, pitying, nor will I quit my hold of thee until thy blessing light on me. The richness and variety of Jewish culture in Moslem Spain was summed up in the Ibn Ezra family at Granada. Jacob ibn Ezra held an important post in the government of King Habas under Samuel ibn Nagdala. His home was a salon of literature and philosophy. Of his 4 sons, reared in this atmosphere of learning, 3 reached distinction. Joseph rose to high office in the state and to leadership of the Jewish community. Isaac was a poet, a scientist, and a Talmudist. Moses ibn Ezra, who lived from 1070 to 1139, was a scholar, a philosopher, and the greatest Jewish poet of the generation before Halevi. His happy youth ended when he fell in love with a beautiful niece, whose father, his older brother Isaac, married her to his younger brother Abraham. Moses left Granada, wandered through strange lands, and fed his hopeless passion with poetry. Though thy lips drop honey for others to sip, live on, breathe myrrh for others to inhale. Thou art false to me, yet shall I be true to thee till the cold earth claims her own. My heart rejoices in the nightingale's song, though the singer soars above me and afar. In the end, like Gabirol, he turned his harp to piety and sang psalms of mystic surrender. Abraham ben Meir ibn Ezra, whom Browning used as a mouthpiece of Victorian philosophy, was a distant relative but an intimate friend of Moses ibn Ezra. Born in Toledo in 1093, his youth knew hunger and thirsted for knowledge in every field. He too wandered from town to town, from occupation to occupation, luckless in all. "Were candles my merchandise," he said with the wry humor of the Jew, "the sun would never set. If I sold burial shrouds, men would live forever." He traveled through Egypt and Iraq to Iran, perhaps to India, back to Italy, then to France and England. At 75 he was returning to Spain when he died, still poor, but acclaimed throughout Jewry for both his poetry and his prose. His works were as varied as his domiciles, on mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, religion. His poems ranged through love and friendship, God and nature, anatomy and the seasons, chess and the stars. He gave poetic form to ideas ubiquitous in the age of faith, and he anticipated Newman in a Hebrew melody. O God of earth and heaven, spirit and flesh are thine. Thou hast in wisdom given man's inward light divine. My times are in thy hand, thou knowest what is best, and where I fear to stand, thy strength brings succor blessed. Thy mantle hides my sins, thy mercies are my sure defense, and for thy bounteous providence thou wilt demand no recompense. His contemporaries valued him chiefly for his biblical commentaries on every book of the Old Testament. He defended the authenticity and divine inspiration of the Hebrew Scriptures, but interpreted as metaphors the anthropomorphic phrases applied to the deity. He was the first to suggest that the book of Isaiah was the work of two prophets, not one. Spinoza considered him a founder of rational biblical criticism. The greatest European poet of his age was Jehuda Halevi, from 1086 to possibly 1147. Born at Toledo a year after its capture by Alfonso VI of Castile, he grew up in security under the most enlightened and liberal Christian monarch of the time. One of his early poems pleased Moses ibn Ezra. The older poet invited Jehuda to come and stay with him in Granada. There Moses and Isaac ibn Ezra entertained him for months in their homes. His verses were read, his epigrams were repeated in every Jewish community in Spain. His poetry reflected his genial character and his fortunate youth. He sang of love with all the skill and artifice of a Moslem or Provençal troubadour, and with the sensuous intensity of the Song of Songs. One poem, The Garden of His Delight, put into fervent verse the frankest passages of that erotic masterpiece. Come down, her beloved, why tarriest thou to feed amid her gardens? Turn aside to the couch of love, to gather her lilies. Secret apples of her breasts give forth their fragrance. For thee she hideth in her necklaces precious fruits, shining like light. She would shame but for her veil all the stars of heaven. Leaving the Ibn Ezra's courteous hospitality, Halevi went to Lucena and studied for several years in the Jewish academy there. He took up medicine and became an undistinguished practitioner. He founded a Hebrew institute in Toledo and lectured there on the Scriptures. He married and had 4 children. As he grew older, he became more conscious of Israel's misfortunes than of his own prosperity. He began to sing of his people, their sorrows and their faith. Like so many Jews, he longed to end his days in Palestine. O city of the world, Jerusalem, beauteous in proud splendor, oh, that I had eagle's wings, that I might fly to thee till I wet thy dust with my tears. My heart is in the east, while I tarry in the west. Comfortable Spanish Jews accepted such verses as a poetical pose, but Halevi was sincere. In 1141, leaving his family in good hands, he began an arduous pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Unfavorable winds drove his ship off course to Alexandria. There the Jewish community feted him and begged him not to venture into Jerusalem, then in the Crusaders' hands. After some delay he went on to Damietta and Tyre, and thence for some unknown reason to Damascus. There he disappeared from history. Legend says that he made his way to Jerusalem, knelt at the first sight of it, kissed the earth, and was trampled to death by an Arab horseman. We do not know if he ever reached the city of his dreams. We do know that at Damascus, perhaps in the last year of his life, he composed an ode to Zion that Goethe ranked among the greatest poems in world literature. Art thou not, Zion, fain to send forth greetings from thy sacred rock unto thy captive train, who greet thee as the remnants of thy flock? Harsh is my voice when I bewail thy woes, but when in fancy's dream I see thy freedom, forth its cadence flows, sweet as the harps that hung by Babel's stream. I would that, where God's Spirit was of yore poured out unto thy holy ones, I might there too my soul outpour. The house of kings and throne of God wert thou. How comes it then that now slaves fill the throne, where sat thy kings before? O who will lead me on to seek the posts where, in far distant years, the angels in their glory dawned upon thy messengers and seers? O who will give me wings, that I may fly away, and there, at rest from all my wanderings, the ruins of my heart among thy ruins lay. I'll bend my face unto thy soil, and hold thy stones as precious gold. Thy air is life unto my soul, thy grains of dust are myrrh, thy streams with honey flow. Naked and barefoot to thy ruined fanes how gladly would I go. To where the ark was treasured, and in dim recesses dwelt the holy cherubim. Perfect in beauty, Zion, how in thee do love and grace unite. The souls of thy companions tenderly turn unto thee. Thy joy was their delight, and weeping they lament thy ruin now in distant exile. For thy sacred height they long, and toward thy gates in prayer they bow. The Lord desires thee for his dwelling place eternally, and blessed is he whom God has chosen for the grace within thy courts to rest. Happy is he that watches, drawing near, until he sees thy glorious lights arise, and over whom thy dawn breaks full and clear, set in the orient skies. But happiest he who, with exultant eyes, the bliss of thy redeemed ones shall behold, and see thy youth renewed, as in the days of old. 2. The Adventures of the Talmud. The Jews of that golden age in Spain were too prosperous to be as deeply religious as their poets became in declining years. They produced verses joyous and sensuous and graceful, and expressed a philosophy that confidently reconciled the Holy Scriptures with Greek thought. Even when Almohad fanaticism drove the Jews from Moslem into Christian Spain, they continued to prosper. And Jewish academies flourished under Christian tolerance in Toledo, Girona, and Barcelona in the 13th century. But in France and Germany the Jews were not so fortunate. They crowded their narrow quarters timidly, and gave their best minds to the study of the Talmud. They did not bother to justify their faith to the secular world. They never questioned its premises. They consumed themselves in the law. The academy founded by Rabbi Gershom at Mainz became one of the most influential schools of its time. Hundreds of students gathered there, and shared with Gershom in editing and clarifying, through 2 generations of labor, the Talmudic text. A similar role was played in France by Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzhak, from 1040 to 1105, fondly called Rashi from the first letters of his title and his name. Born at Troyes in Champagne, he studied in the Jewish academies of Worms, Mainz, and Speyer. Returning to Troyes, he supported his family by selling wine, but gave every leisure hour to the Bible and the Talmud. Though not officially a rabbi, he founded an academy at Troyes, taught there for 40 years, and gradually composed commentaries on the Old Testament, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. He did not try, as some Spanish scholars had done, to read philosophical ideas into the religious texts. He merely explained these with such lucid learning that his Talmudic commentaries are now printed with the Talmud. The modest purity of his character and his life won him reverence among his people as a saint. Jewish communities everywhere in Europe sent him questions in theology and law, and gave legal authority to his replies. His old age was saddened by the pogroms of the First Crusade. After his death, his grandsons Samuel, Jacob, and Isaac ben Meir continued his work. Jacob was the first of the Tosafists. For 5 generations after Rashi, the French and German Talmudists revised and amended his commentaries with Tosafoth, or supplements. The Talmud had hardly been completed when Justinian outlawed the book in 553 as a tissue of puerilities, fables, iniquities, insults, imprecations, heresies, and blasphemies. Thereafter, the Church seems to have forgotten the existence of the Talmud. Few theologians of the Latin Church could read the Hebrew or Aramaic in which it was written, and for 700 years the Jews were free to study the cherished volumes, so sedulously that they in turn seem almost to have forgotten the Bible. But in 1239, Nicolas Donat, a French Jew converted to Christianity, laid before Pope Gregory IX an indictment of the Talmud as containing shameful insults of Christ and the Virgin, and incitations to dishonesty in dealing with Christians. Some of the charges were true, for the assiduous compilers had so reverenced the Tanaim and Amoraim as to include in the Haggadic or popular portion of the Gemara occasional remarks in which irate rabbis had struck back at Christian critiques of Judaism. But Donat, now more Christian than the Pope, added several charges that could not be substantiated. that the Talmud considered it permissible to deceive and meritorious to kill a Christian, no matter how good, that the Jews were allowed by their rabbis to break promises made under oath, and that any Christian who studied the Jewish law was to be put to death. Gregory ordered all discoverable copies of the Talmud in France, England, and Spain to be turned over to the Dominicans or the Franciscans, bade the monks examine the books carefully, and commanded that the books be burned if the charges proved true. No record has been found of the aftermath of this order. In France, Louis IX directed all Jews to surrender their copies of the Talmud on pain of death, and summoned 4 rabbis to Paris to defend the book in public debate before the king, queen, Blanche d'Aunay, and 2 leading scholastic philosophers, William of Auvergne and Albertus Magnus. After 3 days' inquiry, the king ordered all copies of the Talmud to be burned in 1240. Walter Cornutus, Archbishop of Sens, interceded for the Jews, and the king allowed many copies to be restored to their owners. But the archbishop died soon afterward, and some monks were of opinion that this was the judgment of God on the royal lenience. Convinced by them, Louis ordered the confiscation of all copies of the Talmud. 24 cartloads were brought to Paris and were committed to the flames in 1242. The possession of the Talmud was prohibited in France by a papal legate in 1248, and thereafter rabbinical studies in Hebrew literature declined in all of France except Provence. A similar debate took place in Barcelona in 1263. Raymond of Penyafort, a Dominican monk in charge of the Inquisition in Aragon and Castile, undertook to convert the Jews of these states to Christianity. To equip his preachers, he arranged for the teaching of Hebrew in the seminaries of Christian Spain. A converted Jew, Paul the Christian, assisted him, and so impressed Raymond with his knowledge of both Christian and Jewish theology that the monk arranged a disputation between Paul and Rabbi Moses ben Nachman of Gerona before King James I of Aragon. Maimonides came reluctantly, fearing victory as much as defeat. The debate continued for 4 days to the delight of the king. Apparently the amenities were reasonably observed. In 1264, an ecclesiastical commission commandeered all copies of the Talmud in Aragon, obliterated the anti-Christian passages, and returned the books to their owners. In an account that Maimonides wrote of his debate for the Jewish synagogues of Aragon, he spoke of Christianity in terms that seemed to Raymond grossly blasphemous. The monk protested to the king, but it was not till 1266 that James, yielding to papal insistence, banished Maimonides from Spain. A year later, the rabbi died in Palestine. 3. Science among the Jews. Jewish science and philosophy in the Middle Ages were almost entirely domiciled in Islam. Isolated and scorned, and yet influenced by their neighbors, the Jews of medieval Christendom took refuge in mysticism, superstition, and messianic dreams. No situation could have favored science less. Religion, however, encouraged the study of astronomy, for on this depended the correct determination of the holy days. In the 6th century, the Jewish astronomers of Babylonia substituted astronomic calculation for direct observation of the heavens. They based the year on the apparent movements of the sun and the months on the phases of the moon, gave Babylonian names to the months, made some months full with 30 days, some defective with 29, and then reconciled the lunar with the solar calendar by inserting a 13th month every 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19th year in a 19-year cycle. In the East, the Jews dated events by the Seleucid calendar, which began at 312 B.C. In Europe, in the 9th century, they adopted the present Jewish era, Anno Mundi, Year of the World, beginning with the supposed creation in 3761 B.C. The Jewish calendar is as clumsy and sacred as our own. One of the earliest astronomers in Islam was the Jewish scholar Mashallah, who died circa 815. His De Scientia Motus Orbis was translated from Arabic into Latin by Gerard of Cremona and won wide acclaim in Christendom. His treatise De Mercibus on prices is the oldest extant scientific work in the Arabic tongue. The foremost mathematical treatise of the age was the Hibur HaMashiyah on algebra, geometry, and trigonometry of Abraham ben Hia of Barcelona, who lived from 1065 to 1136, who also composed a lost encyclopedia of mathematics, astronomy, optics, and music, and the earliest surviving Hebrew treatise on the calendar. Abraham ibn Ezra, in the next generation, found no conflict between writing poetry and advancing combinatorial analysis. These two Abrahams were the first Jews to write scientific works in Hebrew rather than in Arabic. Through such books and a flood of translations from Arabic into Hebrew, Muslim science and philosophy invaded the Jewish communities of Europe and broadened their intellectual life beyond purely rabbinical lore. Profiting in some measure from Islamic science, but also recapturing their own traditions of the healing art, the Jews of this period wrote outstanding treatises on medicine, and became the most esteemed physicians in Christian Europe. Isaac Israeli, who lived circa 855 to circa 955, acquired such fame as an ophthalmologist in Egypt that he was appointed physician to the Aghlabid court at Kairouan. His medical works, translated from Arabic into Hebrew and Latin, were acclaimed as classics throughout Europe. They were used as textbooks at Salerno and Paris, and were quoted after 700 years of life in Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621. Tradition describes Isaac as indifferent to wealth, an obstinate scholar, and a centenarian. Probably contemporary with him was Asaph HaJehudi, the obscure author of a recently discovered manuscript, reckoned to be the oldest extant medical work in Hebrew, and remarkable for its teaching that the blood circulates through the arteries and the veins. Had he surmised the function of the heart, he would have completely anticipated Harvey. In Egypt, after the arrival of Maimonides in 1165, the medical art was dominated by Jewish practitioners and texts. Abu al-Fada of Cairo wrote the principal ophthalmological treatise of the 12th century, and Al-Kuhin al-Attar composed circa 1275 a pharmacopoeia still used in the Muslim world. The Jewish physicians of southern Italy and Sicily served as one medium through which Arabic medicine entered Salerno. Shabbatai ben Abraham, who lived from 913 to 970, called Donolo, born near Otranto, was captured by Saracens, studied Arabic medicine at Palermo, and then returned to practice in Italy. Benvenutus Grassus, a Jerusalem Jew, studied at Salerno, taught there and at Montpellier, and wrote a Practica Oculorum, circa 1250, which Islam and Christendom alike accepted as the definitive treatise on diseases of the eye. 224 years after its publication, it was chosen as the first book to be printed on its theme. Rabbinical schools, especially in southern France, gave courses in medicine, partly to provide rabbis with a secular income. Jewish physicians trained in the Hebrew Academy at Montpellier helped to develop the famous Montpellier School of Medicine. The appointment of a Jew as regent of the faculty in 1300 drew upon his people the wrath of the medical authorities in the University of Paris. The Montpellier School was forced to close its doors to Jews in 1301, and the Hebrew physicians of the city shared in the banishment of the Jews from France in 1306. By this time, however, Christian medicine had been revolutionized by Jewish and Muslim example and influence. The Semitic practitioners had long since put behind them the theory of sickness as possession by demons, and the success of their rational diagnosis and therapy had weakened the belief of the people in the efficacy of relics and other supernatural means of cure. The monks and secular clergy whose abbeys and churches housed relics and drew pilgrims found it hard to accept this revolution. The Church condemned the intimate reception of Jewish doctors into Christian homes. She suspected that these men had more physic than faith, and she dreaded their influence upon sick minds. In 1246 the Council of Béziers forbade Christians to employ Jewish physicians. In 1267 the Council of Vienna forbade Jewish physicians to treat Christians. Such prohibitions did not prevent some prominent Christians from availing themselves of Jewish medical skill. Pope Boniface VIII, suffering from an eye ailment, called in Isaac ben Mordecai. Raymond Lully complained that every monastery had a Jewish physician. A papal legate was shocked to find that this was also the fate of many nunneries. And Christian kings of Spain enjoyed Jewish medical care down to the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. Chechet Benveniste of Barcelona, physician to King James I of Aragon, who lived from 1213 to 1276, wrote the chief gynecological treatise of his time. The Jews lost their ascendancy in the medical practice of Christendom only when Christian universities in the 13th century adopted rational medicine. For so mobile and scattered a people, the Jews contributed little to the science of geography. Nevertheless, the outstanding travelers of the 12th century were two Jews, Petachia of Ratisbon and Benjamin of Tudela, who wrote valuable Hebrew narratives of their journeys through Europe and the Near East. Benjamin left Saragossa in 1160, leisurely visited Barcelona, Marseille, Genoa, Pisa, Rome, Salerno, Brindisi, Otranto, Corfu, Constantinople, the Aegean Isles, Antioch, every important city in Palestine, and Baalbek, Damascus, Baghdad, and Persia. He returned by ship through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea to Egypt, Sicily, and Italy, and thence overland to Spain. He reached home in 1173 and died soon afterward. His main interest was in the Jewish communities, but he described with fair accuracy and objectivity the geographic and ethnic features of each country on his route. His account is less fascinating, but probably more reliable than the reports made by Marco Polo a century later. It was translated into nearly all European languages and remained till our time a favorite book with the Jews. 4. The Rise of Jewish Philosophy. The life of the mind is a composition of two forces, the necessity to believe in order to live, and the necessity to reason in order to advance. In ages of poverty and chaos, the will to believe is paramount, for courage is the one thing needful. In ages of wealth, the intellectual powers come to the fore as offering preferment and progress. Consequently, a civilization passing from poverty to wealth tends to develop a struggle between reason and faith, a warfare of science with theology. In this conflict, philosophy, dedicated to seeing life whole, usually seeks a reconciliation of opposites, a mediating peace, with the result that it is scorned by science and suspected by theology. In an age of faith where hardship makes life unbearable without hope, philosophy inclines to religion, uses reason to defend faith, and becomes a disguised theology. Among the three faiths that divided white civilization in the Middle Ages, this was least true of Islam, which had most wealth, truer of Christendom, which had less, truest of Judaism, which had least. And Jewish philosophy ventured from faith chiefly in the prosperous Jewry of Moslem Spain. Medieval Jewish philosophy had two sources, Hebrew religion and Moslem thought. Most Jewish thinkers conceived of religion and philosophy as similar in content and result, differing only in method and form. What religion taught as divinely revealed dogma, philosophy would teach as rationally demonstrated truth. And most Jewish thinkers, from Saadia to Maimonides, made this attempt in a Moslem milieu, derived their knowledge of Greek philosophy from Arabic translations and Moslem commentaries, and wrote in Arabic for Moslems as well as Jews. Just as Ash'ari turned against the Mutazilites the weapons of reason, and saved the orthodoxy of Islam, so Saadia, who left Egypt for Babylonia in the very year, 915, of Ash'ari's conversion from skepticism, saved Hebrew theology by his polemic industry and skill. And Saadia followed not only the methods of the Moslem Mutakallimun, but even the details of their arguments. Saadia's victory had the same effect in Eastern Judaism as Al-Ghazali's in Eastern Islam. It combined with political disorder and economic decline to smother Hebrew philosophy in the Orient. The rest of the story belongs to Africa and Spain. At Kairouan, Isaac Israeli found time, amid his medical practice and writing, to compose some influential philosophical works. His Essay on Definitions gave several terms to scholastic logic. His treatise on the Elements introduced Aristotle's physics to Hebrew thought. His book of Soul and Spirit replaced the creation story of Genesis with a Neoplatonist scheme of progressive emanations, or splendors, from God to the material world. Here was one source of the Kabbalah. Ibn Gabirol had more influence as a philosopher than as a poet. It is one of the jeux d'esprit of history that the scholastics quoted him with respect as Avicebron, and thought him a Moslem or a Christian. Not till 1846 did Salomon Monk discover that Ibn Gabirol and Avicebron were one. The misunderstanding had almost been prepared by Gabirol's attempt to write philosophy in terms fully independent of Judaism. His anthology of Proverbs, Choice of Pearls, took nearly all its quotations from non-Jewish sources, though Hebrew folklore is peculiarly rich in pointed and pithy apothegms. One pearl is quite Confucian. How shall one take vengeance on an enemy? By increasing one's good qualities. This is practically a summary of the treatise on the improvement of the moral qualities, which Gabirol seems to have composed at 24, when philosophy is unbecoming. By an artificial schematism, the young poet derived all virtues and vices from the five senses, with platitudinous results. But the book had the distinction of seeking to construct, in the age of faith, a moral code unsupported by religious belief. With like audacity, Gabirol's chef-d'oeuvre, Mekor Hayim, refrained from quoting either the Bible, the Talmud, or the Quran. It was this unusual supranationalism that made the book so offensive to the rabbis and, when translated into Latin as Fons Vitae, the fountain of life, so influential in Christendom. Gabirol accepted the Neoplatonism that permeated all Arabic philosophy, but he imposed upon it a voluntarism that stressed the action of the will in God and man. We must, said Gabirol, assume the existence of God as first substance, first essence, or primary will, in order to understand the existence or motion of anything at all. But we cannot know the attributes of God. The universe was not created in time, but flows in continuous and graduated emanations from God. Everything in the universe except God is composed of matter and form. These always appear together and can be separated only in thought. The rabbis repudiated this Avicennian cosmology as a disguised materialism. But Alexander of Hales, St. Bonaventure, and Duns Scotus accepted the universality of matter under God and the primacy of will. William of Auvergne nominated Gabirol as the noblest of all philosophers and thought him a good Christian. Jehuda Halevi rejected all speculation as vain intellectualism. Like Al-Ghazali, he feared that philosophy was undermining religion, not merely by questioning dogma or ignoring it or interpreting the Bible metaphorically, but even more by substituting argument for devotion. Against the invasion of Judaism by Plato and Aristotle and the seduction of Jews by Mohammedanism and the continuing attacks of Karaite Jews upon the Talmud, the poet wrote one of the most interesting books of medieval philosophy, the Al-Khazari, circa 1140. He presented his ideas in a dramatic mise-en-scène, the conversion of the Khazar king to the Jewish faith. Luckily for Halevi, the book, though written in the Arabic language, used the Hebrew alphabet, which confined its audience to educated Jews. For the story, bringing a bishop, a mullah, and a rabbi before the curious king, makes short work of both Mohammedanism and Christianity. When the Christian and the Moslem quote the Hebrew scriptures as the word of God, the king dismisses them and keeps the rabbi. And most of the book is the conversation of the rabbi instructing a docile and circumcised king in Judaic theology and ritual. Says the royal pupil to his teacher, "There has been nothing new since your religion was promulgated, except certain details concerning paradise and hell." So encouraged, the rabbi explains that Hebrew is the language of God, and that God spoke directly only to the Jews, and that only the Jewish prophets were divinely inspired. Halevi smiles at philosophers who proclaim the supremacy of reason and subject God and the heavens to their syllogisms and categories, while obviously the human mind is merely a fragile and infinitesimal fraction of a vast and complex creation. The wise man, who is not necessarily learned, will recognize the weakness of reason in transmundane affairs. He will keep to the faith given him in the Scriptures, and he will believe and pray as simply as a child. Despite Halevi, the fascination of reason survived, and the Aristotelian invasion continued. Abraham ibn Daud, from 1110 to 1180, was as deeply Jewish as Halevi. He defended the Talmud against the Karaites, and proudly narrated the history of the Jewish kings in the Second Commonwealth. But along with countless Christians, Muslims, and Jews of the 12th and 13th centuries, he aspired to prove his faith with philosophy. Like Halevi, he was born in Toledo and made his living as a physician. His Arabic Kitab al-Aqidah al-Rafiya, Book of the Sublime Faith, gave the same answer to Halevi that Aquinas would give to the Christian enemies of philosophy. The peaceful defense of a religion against non-believers requires reasoning, and cannot rest upon simple faith. A few years before Averroes, 1126 to 1198, a generation before Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, a century before St. Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, Ibn Daud labored to reconcile the faith of his fathers with the philosophy of Aristotle. The Greek would have been amused to find himself the recipient of such a triple compliment, or to learn that the Jewish philosophers knew him only in the summaries of Al-Farabi and Avicenna, who knew him through imperfect translations and a Neoplatonist forgery. Truer than St. Thomas to their common Aristotelian source, Ibn Daud, like Averroes, claimed immortality only for the universal psyche, not for the individual soul. Here, Halevi might have complained, Aristotle triumphed over the Talmud as well as the Quran. Jewish philosophy, like medieval philosophy in general, had begun with Neoplatonism and piety, and was culminating in Aristotle and doubt. Maimonides would take his start from this Aristotelian stand of Ibn Daud and would face with courage and skill all the problems of reason in conflict with faith. 5. Maimonides, 1135 to 1204. The greatest of medieval Jews was born in Cordova, son of the distinguished scholar, physician, and judge, Maimon ben Joseph. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1.